Joining me today is retired General John W. Vessey Jr., former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. General Vessey, welcome to Minnesota Military Radio.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sir, I want to take you back just a couple of years to when you originally enlisted into the Minnesota National Guard. You're from Minnesota.
Indeed.
And born and raised in Twin Cities, sir?
No, I was really. I spent my early years in Lakeville, when Lakeville was a town of around 500 people, and moved to Minneapolis in time to go to high school in Minneapolis.
All right, sir. And then in 1939, I understand, you decided you needed to make a couple of bucks on the weekends and thought about joining the Minnesota National Guard.
Well, some friends of mine had joined and urged me to. You realize it was in the midst of the Depression, and of course it was also at about the time that the seeds of what later became World War II were being sown, both in Europe and in East Asia. So joining the National Guard seemed like a good idea, and it was not those were not easy days for a teenager to pick up a little extra change. So I've forgotten exactly. I think it was 70 cents a day from the federal government and 30 cents a day from the state was what the National Guard provided in those days, and that seemed quite generous at the time.
Sir, were you generally aware that what Germany was doing in Europe and what Japan was up to, or was that some distant place?
Well, it was both a distant place, but it was also something that was in the newspapers, and certainly we were aware of it. My father had been an infantry squad leader and then a platoon leader in the Rainbow Division in World War I, and he followed the events in Europe closely at the time, and certainly made me aware of them and the dangers, and he was absolutely convinced that if there were to be a war, that eventually the United States would be involved.
So, General, when you enlisted in the Minnesota National Guard, were they holding basic training in the state here at those days, or? At
that time, basic training was conducted both in the National Guard and in the regular Army by the unit into which you enlisted. The training establishment was a creation later on in the early days of, in actually 1940, a year later, was the beginning of the training establishment. But whatever training you got in the unit into which you enlisted.
So you enlisted as a private?
Yes.
In the enlisted ranks?
Yes.
In the first 2 or 3 years, probably pretty quiet, but you moved up quickly?
Well, I don't know that I moved up very quickly. There were opportunities to do additional things. One of the real attractions for me is I was told I would be able to ride the motorcycle in the outfit. That was an opening that this outfit had, and that seemed attractive to me at the time. And I must say that it was probably more of a driver than the idea that I was going to save the world for democracy or something like that.
Well, a motorcycle is pretty good motivation for a young man, isn't it?
Right, and the Army had good Harleys, and there were good machines.
General, do you remember where you were on December 7th, 1941?
I remember it very well. We had been on maneuvers for about 5 months. We had been mobilized in February of 1941, and were stationed at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. And in late May, we had some early maneuvers in the Louisiana area, and then into East Texas. And following that, the big Louisiana maneuver of 1941 took place. After that, our outfit was designated the headquarters of the 1st Provisional Tank Destroyer Group to test out the concept of tank destroyer outfits. And we went on maneuvers in the Carolinas. We went immediately from the Louisiana maneuvers to the Carolinas and maneuvered against General Patton's 2nd Armored Division in the Carolinas. And we got back to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, the night of December 6th, 1941, the day before Pearl Harbor. And so we listened to the radio reports from Hawaii that afternoon, the next day on the 7th. So I remember very well where I was on December 7th.
And, sir, were you assigned to the 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bulls?
Yes, I was.
And once Japan attacked and Pearl Harbor happened, what happened next for the 34th Infantry Division?
Well, we got an assignment to patrol the Gulf Coast. I don't think there was much danger of the Japanese coming ashore on the Gulf Coast, but certainly the United States was surprised by the attack at Pearl Harbor, and it's understandable that we were then sent down to the Gulf Coast, and our commander believed that we would probably be deployed early, and he sent half of us on leave during the first half of December, and then the other half on leave the second half of December. And indeed, he was correct. I was in the group that was on leave in the second half of December and was back here in Minneapolis and had a date with my then girlfriend, who later became my wife after World War II, to bring in the new year at the old Nicollet Hotel in downtown Minneapolis. And I got a telegram on the 30th saying, "Return immediately." Well, I'd already had $50 put into the New Year's Eve date, and I decided I would that immediately would be the 1st of January for me, instead of the 30th of December, which was almost a big mistake, because I took the train down on the 1st of January, and by the time I got to Camp Claiborne, our Battery Street was empty, and a civilian employee told me that the troops were loading up on the train at Oakdale, Louisiana, which was another $20 taxi ride from Camp Claiborne. But I got to the train on time, and my buddies had packed up my stuff and put it on the train, and we were on our way to Fort Dix in preparation for going overseas.
So that was your first escape, sir. And when you went overseas, did you, I understand did you go to Ireland, sir?
We went to North Ireland. We spent a fair amount of time at Fort Dix before we got underway. The first elements of the 34th Division went to North Ireland in January. And by that early 1942, the Germans had a great flotilla of submarines in the North Atlantic, and it was very difficult to get things from the United States to Europe, and a lot of ships were sunk. I think we were originally scheduled to go on the Normandy, which was a great French liner, but it somehow sunk, I believe, right around in the New York harbor. And so we were delayed and finally left in April of 1942. So we spent 3 months at Fort Dix before we actually got underway, and our equipment had already been shipped. So all we had was our packs and our rifles. So we spent a lot of time at the rifle range and doing road marches in preparation for our trip to Ireland. But we got to Ireland in April of 42.
And you went by ship. How was the crossing? Were you nervous?
Well, we went in a big convoy. huge convoy. We had I have no idea how many destroyers we had.
Good escort ships and relatively safe.
Cruisers in the convoy, and daily there were. It wasn't a day that went by that we didn't have depth charges being dropped, and obviously submarines that were attempting to hit the convoy. We went on on the Aquitania, which was an old four-stacker. It was about, you've seen the Lusitania, the pictures of Lusitania. It looked like that same ship, and it sprung some plates during the trip over because of depth charges being dropped close to it, and had a leak. In fact, we moved. Many of the troops were moved from one side of the ship to the other because the ship was listing. And we, instead of having your own bunk, we hot bunked on the other side of the ship. And when we got to Belfast, the Aquitania couldn't dock in Belfast, so we went to Greenock, Scotland, and transferred to North Sea lighters and came back across the channel to Ireland.
So did you do some training in Ireland then, sir?
Oh, yes. That's all we did in Ireland, is train.
Missed all the good parts.
Well, we were very well received. I must say, I was as well received as a soldier in Northern Ireland as I was anywhere in the United States at any time.
And then following Ireland, where did you go, sir?
We went to North Africa. Part of the division made the invasion of North Africa in November of 42 at Algiers, and the rest of the division, the rest of us closed in December of 42.
The first time in combat, probably for most of the soldiers in the 34th Infantry Division.
We still had a few World War I veterans in the outfit. Some of the senior people were World War I vets, but for the most part, yes, indeed, it was first time in combat.
So the reality hit real quickly, didn't it?
It did. The elements of the 34th actually fired the first American artillery rounds against the Germans in World War II, the 175th Field Artillery from Minneapolis at Madras el-Bab, and late November of 42, I think it was, fired the first American artillery rounds against the Germans in World War II. The rest of us didn't get into the fight until, actually late January of 1942, when we got to the front, and just shortly before Rommel made his big attack, which is generally called in the history books the Battle of Kasserine Pass, but actually the big battles were fought before Kasserine Pass at a place called Sidi Bouzid. In fact, the greatest number of casualties, I think, that the 34th Division took in any particular battle occurred in that battle at Sidi Bouzid. The 168th Infantry, which was an Iowa regiment, was strung out in a position that couldn't be well supported, and lost really 2 battalions in that battle.
General, when you were in North Africa in these battles, how would you rate your training, equipment, supplies, food?
Well, I'd say our training was good, but not for the war we were fighting. It was a desert fight against very competent, well-equipped German armored troops with equipment that was better than ours. Their tanks were better than our tanks. I was in the field artillery, and we were firing British guns at that time in North Africa. The light artillery battalions of the 34th were equipped with British 25-pounders. We had turned in our World War I French 75s and were re-equipped with the British 25-pounders, which was a good gun. Later on, they were replaced by the American 105s, which was a better gun. The logistic support was poor. The Americans were learning how to do that. Rick Atkinson wrote a book which was published here a few years ago called The Army at Dawn. And it portrays the problems of the American Army in the battles in North Africa. And it's for those interested, it's well worth reading, and for those in the American military, it's compulsory reading to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen again. We ate British rations, not American rations. The British rations are fine, certainly had enough caloric support, but they weren't meals that appealed to Americans. And the drink was tea with the sugar and milk already mixed in this dried tea arrangement that came to your mess truck, which is not really an American soldier's drink. Water was hard to come by. You'd got a canteen cup full of that tea in the morning, and what it provided was the tea drink for your breakfast and then the shaving water for your daily shave afterward. So, we could go on and on.
Not your favorite, sir.
Our extra clothing was in a barracks bag. We stored our barracks bag at a town called Lakeville, and the Germans promptly bombed that town and destroyed our barracks bag. So the clothing we had was what we had on our backs or in our packs. So we were a pretty scroungy-looking outfit, to tell you the truth.
Learning the meaning of logistics, the right way or the wrong way. Sir, I understand you rose through the ranks to first sergeant. I'm reading from a quote you gave in a newspaper article in 1983. They asked you what rank sticks out that you enjoyed more than any other. And your response was, I think the toughest job I had, and the one I remember as having more personal responsibility than any other, was being a first sergeant in combat. But it was also a good job. Was that tougher than being chairman?
Well, not really, and I was a lot more mature when I was chairman than I was when I was a first sergeant. I think that at the time that I was promoted to first sergeant, I think the Stars and Stripes had an article suggesting that I was the youngest first sergeant in the United States Army, and I don't know whether that's true or not, but I was certainly in competition for that title. But we had a good outfit, and it was responsibility that was far heavier than my age and experience at the time. Fortunately, I served under good commanders, and as I say, had a good outfit, and that made the job a little easier. But it was indeed a hard job.
Sir, I'm reading from another article, and it says they were talking to you, and you said among your favorite mementos is a short Fifth Army radiogram appointing you and one other 34th Division sergeant to be second lieutenants. It was signed simply Clark. Have you still got that piece of paper, sir?
I think it's in the library at the National Defense University, to tell you the truth.
A very dramatic change in your career, however.
It was. That was some years later from after the war in North Africa.
And you also said in the same article that many years later, well over 30 years later, you walked from a change of command ceremony to your new office as Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command in Korea, and outside the office door was a brass plaque engraved with the names of former commanders, including, of course, General Mark Clark, who was the commander during the historic period, the last year of the Korean War, and signing the armistice. And you went on to say, I couldn't help but wonder if General Clark really knew what he had wrought when he signed a routine order for a National Guard sergeant to be a second lieutenant back in 1944.
Right. Well, I got to meet General Clark years later after he had retired. And of course, he said he remembered my name from World War II, and I'm sure that my name, along with probably 300,000 of the other soldiers that were in Fifth Army at the time, I'm sure he remembered all of them, but he was very kind to me.
Sir, most of the history books talk about Normandy and the invasion of Europe and so forth, but you were over in North Africa and Italy, but you did engage some pretty powerful German troops, and that helped the war effort, didn't it?
Well, you have to ask yourself that there was a great debate in the United States about whether Italy was important or worth doing, and many of the historians still write about that subject and question the value of the war in Italy. But I think if you'd ask yourself, how would Normandy have turned out if the 22 German divisions that were in Italy at the time had been available to defend against the Normandy invasion? And these weren't route order divisions. They were top-notch divisions with excellent commanders. Kesselring, who was the overall German commander in Italy, was certainly a good strategist and a good tactician.
So if those
von
German
Etterling, who commanded the 14th Armored Corps, was a top-notch commander and wrote one of the best German books about that war. The name of his book was translated into English would be Without Fear or Hope, and it was the story of a German commander who knew he was on the losing side, but fought competently with the resources given him against the Americans. So we took Rome the day before D-Day. So the war in Italy had the headlines for about 12 hours, I think, in the United States at that time. And justifiably, the attack in Normandy took over the headlines the next day because it was the route to the ultimate victory in Europe. But I would suggest that campaign would have been a lot more difficult had we not pinned down 22 good German divisions in Italy.
So that they weren't available to
Yes.
beat us off in Normandy.
Yes.
We would have lost a lot more American men, wouldn't we?
Indeed.
Sir, after the war, you could have returned home a hero, but you chose to stay in the military.
Well, I don't know whether I'd returned home as a hero. There were, 10 million Americans in the armed forces at that time, and most of them returned home as heroes, so you'd been one among 10 million. But that was fine. And I seriously considered getting out at the end of World War II and came within a whisker of doing just that. But I came home from a day of training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and I told my wife how much I had enjoyed that day and how satisfying it was to do what I was doing, And at that particular time, I had my papers put in to get out. And she said, why are you getting out if you like this so much? And I said, well, I thought you wanted me to get out. She said, no, I want you to do what you want to do and what you enjoy doing. And so I retrieved my papers and didn't get out.
Great support from your wife, sir.
Indeed.
General, World War II, most of my generation and people younger than me weren't around for World War II. I don't think they understand the concept of world war, world at war, and the fact that when you went to war, you stayed at war until it was done.
Yes, it's we've had a number of wars since then, but it was the last time that the nation was at war. We had almost every able-bodied man from the age of 18 to 35 was in uniform or doing something tied to the war effort. And the women in the country had taken over many of the men's jobs. And here in Minnesota, they were mining ore, building boats and airplanes and whatever you can think of. 50% of the economic effort of the country was going toward the war effort. No, there wasn't a family that wasn't affected in some way or another by the war, and having somebody in the armed services or somebody supporting the armed services or supporting people that were supporting the armed services. And it's the last time that the nation as a whole was indeed at war. Today, a war going on in Afghanistan, and the nation certainly supports that idea. Here in Minnesota, we do a lot of wonderful things to support the troops. But in fact, the percentage of Minnesotans that are involved in the war itself is infinitesimal, which was not the case during World War II. And as you say, we set out to the war, and you knew you weren't coming home until the war was over.
It's a whole different mindset that I think most people can't understand. And as you say, the economic output of the United States, ships, aircraft, tanks, munitions, ammunition.
We had a year when we built 100,000 aircraft. If you add up all the aircraft that the airlines of the world fly and the armed forces of the United States fly, you don't add up to 100,000. And we were building 100,000 airplanes a year. We had shipyards. We were building a ship a week. Today we have an aircraft carrier under construction. It's been under construction for several years, and it'll be probably another 4 or 5 years before the thing is floated. It was a different world completely.
General, so you made the decision to stay in the military, and then the next thing we know, here comes Korea. Recently on the radio show here, we had a few Marines that served in Korea at the Chosun Reservoir battle. And it was apparent from what they told us that the close air support from not just the Marines, but we had 5 aircraft carriers out on the coast of Korea during that war. Changed the whole dimensions of fighting, didn't it?
Well, it did. And we talked earlier about the early battles in North Africa. In the early days of that war, if we heard an airplane, we didn't look up, because if we heard the airplane, it was most likely an enemy airplane. But that changed by the time the war in North Africa ended in 1943, and the Americans had air superiority, and we've had air superiority every place we've fought since then. And it makes a huge difference when the ground commander can operate and know that he will not be seriously interrupted, at least not for long, by enemy air.
And, sir, we went from a world at war to the Korean War, and it was really a very different war, but it was brutal as well, wasn't it?
It was. I did not go to Korea until the war in Korea was about over. I happened to be in after World War II, we cut the armed forces of the United States dramatically. As we said before, I was a field artilleryman. We had 2 heavy artillery battalions in the United States Army when the Korean War started. We were the 17th Field Artillery and the 18th Field Artillery. We were in barracks next door to each other at the west end of the parade field at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The 17th was an 8-inch outfit, and we were a self-propelled long tom outfit. The Army chose to send the 17th to Korea, probably because it was an 8-inch, which is a more accurate weapon than the long tom 155. But I'm convinced to this day that we could shoot rings around the 17th in those days. And we would have done better than they did, although they did very well in Korea, but we'd have done better. But at any rate, I wound up going to Europe because we were having troubles with the Soviet Union around Berlin at that time, and NATO had been organized the year before the Korean War started, and we were chosen to strengthen NATO, and we reorganized the 4th Infantry Division, and I wound up going to Europe with the 4th Infantry Division. But as indeed you say, the Korean War taught us some lessons, and one of the major lessons it taught us, and I hope it taught the United States a lesson that they haven't forgotten today when it's time to look at defense budgets, and that is, don't emasculate your armed forces just because the war has ended, because we're not sure what will happen next, and keep a good, strong United States defense force.
So, following the Korean War and up to the Vietnam War, there was a lack of investment in the military, is what you're saying.
Well, I think after the Korean War, it was after World War II and up until the Korean War, the armed forces were at a terrible budget. We were rendering our own lard in the mess halls, and we were scrounging paper for toilet paper in the barracks. The soldiers were spending time doing high-level maintenance on the vehicles, even though they were tactical units. So you had people doing less time training for what they were supposed to be doing on the battlefield, just to keep the outfit alive after World War II. After the Korean War, things were better, and of course the Cold War in Europe kept us focused on the Soviet Union. And we certainly did better than we did after World War II in terms of keeping the readiness up for war. Vietnam, of course, took our focus away from Europe and onto the war in Vietnam.
Sir, in the war in Vietnam, I'm reading from another quote from an article in 1982 where you were talking about Vietnam, and you said most of your difficult decisions revolved around ordering people to do something in combat when you were not completely confident about the prospects for success. As a commander of a relatively small counterattack force in Vietnam, we were attacked by a far larger enemy unit. You were ordered to commit your men in response. There was small chance for success, but we did what we had to do. We sustained heavy casualties, but succeeded in taking the pressure off our main defenses until they could respond with even greater strength. A military leader should not commit the force under his charge lightly, but when faced with military necessity, he may be required to sacrifice for greater good. The concept is inherent in our understanding of service to the citizens of our great country. Vietnam was another very different war with an enemy that was sometimes hard to find.
Yes. Every war we've fought since World War II has had some strange facets to it, and certainly Vietnam itself did with a large insurgent group in South Vietnam, in addition to the North Vietnamese regulars, and for those of us fighting that war, it was difficult to tell the difference between the two, and in fact we often confused it. In that particular battle that I was talking about at the time that you cited, we thought we were fighting a Viet Cong regiment. And I found out later, during the time I was doing the negotiations with the Vietnamese on the POW business, I met the commander who was the commander on the other side at that battle. By that time, he was the new Vice Minister of Defense, and he was the commander of the Vietnamese force on the other side, and explained to me that it was not a Viet Cong regiment. It was, in fact, a North Vietnamese division that we were fighting against on the other side on that particular day.
So, sir, was that 1967 when your battalion was nearly overrun by an enemy in a 6-hour-long assault?
Yes.
And I understand you did something unusual with your howitzers.
Yes, well, at least it was unusual for latter-day artillery. I think if you go back to the battles of when artillery was first used, I think it was the Battle of Crécy, when gunpowder was first used, and later on, several hundred years later, at the Civil War, cannons were fired direct fire, but we wound up again firing cannons direct fire at very close range during that battle.
Which, for an Air Force guy, means you pulled them down to the ground and fired them directly into the enemy.
Indeed, and by that time we had a munition that helped us do that. It was called the Beehive munition, and it was a munition designed exactly for that experience, and it actually turned the howitzer shell into a mini shotgun shell. It was loaded with flechettes and had an extra explosive charge in the shell itself to propel the flechettes. They were about like a 10-penny nail with fins on them to stabilize them, and they'd scatter out, and of course one shell would cover considerable area.
When you met the North Vietnamese commander after the war, when you were on your recovery efforts, did he mention anything about that?
He did. It was a strange meeting. We had the plenary session in the morning, which they're always fairly formal, where both sides read what their governments want them to say, and then we were at lunch, and I had a wonderful interpreter, a retired Army Colonel, Andre Savaggio, who was one of these people who could speak almost any Vietnamese dialect and be understood. He could be behind a curtain, and if the Vietnamese people were on the other side of the curtain and wouldn't see the face, they'd believe he was from their village. But he was terrific. But anyway, I was sitting next to this fellow who was the new Vice Minister of Defense, And Andre was sitting behind us in a chair, and this Vietnamese officer said, "You don't know me, but I know you." And by this time, I had been in and out of Hanoi for 6 years, and there was always some publicity on their TV station or in their newspaper about my visits, and I thought he knew me because of that. And then he immediately went on to say, "You were the American commander at the Battle of Suoi Tre, and I was commanding the Vietnamese 9th Division during that battle."
Bit of an awkward moment, sir.
And he said, "You killed a lot of my men that day." And I said, "You killed a lot of my men that day." And then he went on to say that the war was over. We needed to resolve the differences between our two countries.
I bet that was a fascinating meeting.
It was.
Sir, after that deployment to Vietnam, after 30 years as an artilleryman in 1970, you earned your aviator wings from the Army Helicopter School. What happened? Did you get lost, sir?
No, I didn't. Those days, toward the tail end of the Vietnam War, helicopters had become more and more important in Army operations, and the Army helicopter structure had grown faster than the people that's in the structure itself could grow, and the Army needed some more senior officers. And I had flown as an air observer in World War II during the last year of the war, and in fact applied for flight training after World War II, but it turned out I was 6 months too old to get into the program at that time, and in late 1969, I think it was, the Army Times had an article citing the fact that the Army needed more senior officers, lieutenant colonels and colonels in aviation than they had, and that there was an opportunity to apply for flight school. And at the bottom of the article it said, "If you want to apply, just send a postcard." So I thought, well, I think a postcard was a penny in those days, so it seemed like it was worth a penny, and I sent my postcard in, and was told I had been accepted if I could pass the flight physical, and I passed the flight physical and went to helicopter school.
I wonder what your wife said about that one, sir.
Well, she thought it was all right.
General, I understand you returned to Southeast Asia for a second tour, but by that time you had been pinned. You were a brigadier general.
Yes.
And how was the second tour, sir?
Well, it was a very interesting tour. I had finished flight school, and was told that I was on the way to be the assistant division commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, which was then commanded by George Casey, who was the father of the George Casey who was recently Chief of Staff of the Army. And the senior George Casey and I had played a lot of handball together, and I knew him and had great respect for him, and apparently he had asked for or accepted the idea that I be one of his assistant division commanders in Vietnam. But shortly after that, the senior George Casey was killed in a helicopter accident in Vietnam, and the fellow that took his place didn't know me from Adam and wanted somebody different, and so I wound up not going to Vietnam. I went to Thailand instead to command the U.S. Army Support Command Thailand, which in those days supported the Thailand was really a big aircraft carrier for the United States. We had a number of air bases in Thailand that were attacking North Vietnam and also supporting the operations in South Vietnam. And the Army's job was principally to provide the munitions and the communications and so forth. We operated a couple of ports and a big maintenance facility to maintain the equipment that the United States was providing to the Free Laotian forces in the war in Laos. So I went to that job, and then when the Joint Chiefs wanted more direction to the war in Laos, and there was a considerable amount of American effort going to the war in Laos. I was assigned to take over that job of supporting the war in Laos and in charge of all the U.S. military operations in support of the war in Laos. From 1962 until then, we had an officer on the rolls supporting the war in Laos. And in the early years, we had taken him off the rolls of the Army and put him in civilian clothes to do that job. And later the job was, the officer was put back on the rolls of the Army, but the job was Deputy Chief Just Mag Thai, which was the title meant Deputy Chief of the Military Assistance Group to Thailand, but it was actually the head of the Military Assistance Group for Laos. And I got the job at the time that the Joint Chiefs had restructured the job and put me in charge of all of the U.S. support, including the budgets for all operations from the defense budget, which meant much of the money that was going through the CIA to help and train fighters on the Free Laos side fighting the war.
General, after that tour, you went on an incredible run. It sounds like here you got your second star in 1974, your third star in 1975, and your fourth star in 1976. That's a pretty good run, sir.
I was on a roll.
You were. Had to have something to do with all that experience from World War II to Vietnam.
I wasn't sure myself whether I wasn't doing the job properly at the lower level, so they were promoting me to get out of it, or what was happening. But
that has to be one of the best runs I've ever heard of, sir. And after you got the fourth star, you went back to Korea.
Yes.
As Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command, Commander of U.S. Forces, Korea, Commanding General 8th Army, 8th U.S. Army, 1978. He also became the first Commander-in-Chief of the Republic of Korea, United States Combined Forces Command. Must have been pretty challenging.
I had more caps than I had heads, that's for sure.
Well, they gave you a lot of stars and a lot of jobs, sir.
Well, it was a challenging time. It was at the time when, shortly after, in the year following the time that I reported there, President Carter announced that he wanted to take the U.S. ground forces out of Korea. And of course, shortly before I got there, had the axe murders of the American officers in the DMZ had taken place. So the tension between the Republic of Korea and the American forces and the North Koreans was very great at the time. And the political ramifications of reducing or removing the American forces were also very great at the time, both in Korea and here in the United States.
Sir, and then a few years later, you're still a four-star general. You're back in the United States. You're traveling around the world doing things, and you told me you got a call from the Secretary of Defense.
I did. By this time, it was I had put in my retirement papers. I was about to turn 60 years of age, and which was the age at which you were expected to retire if you happened to be lucky enough to stay on that long. I was vice chief of staff of the Army at the time, and I got a call from the Secretary of Defense asking me to meet him. I happened to be in South America, in Uruguay at the time, touring the armies of South America. I got a call asking me to talk to the Secretary, and the Secretary wanted to talk secure, and I couldn't talk secure from Punta del Este, Uruguay on that day, so he told me to ask me when I was returning, and I told him I was returning to the U.S. the next day, and he said, well, come in Monday morning, or he said, call me secure as soon as you get back. Well, it was middle of the night when we got back, and that didn't seem like a sensible thing to call the Secretary of Defense in the middle of the night. So I called his military assistant, who told me not to call him, but to come in early the next morning. And I did that, and by the time I got in to see the Secretary, he was putting on his suit coat and said, come on, we have an appointment with the President in 5 minutes. And I thought, what in the world could this be? I couldn't think of anything that had occurred on my long trip to South America that would be of interest to the President of the United States. But we got in the elevator, and Mr. Weinberger said that the President wanted to settle the issue of the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he said, you're fairly high on a short list. So I told him, well, we can't go over there because my retirement papers have been approved, and I'm building a house in Crow Wing County, Minnesota, and my wife expects me to retire. And the Secretary said, well, you'll just have to tell that to the President because we have an appointment in 3 minutes. So we went to see the President, and I spent about an hour, or a little over an hour, with President Reagan in the Oval Office, with him and me discussing strategy and defense of the United States and what needed to be done. And I had earlier been in the Oval Office with the same sort of an interview with President Carter, and I had been nominated to be Chief of Staff of the Army. Well, I had failed my orals with President Carter, and we decided mutually, that is, mainly he decided, that I should not be Chief of Staff of the Army. and the President President Reagan didn't say anything, and I thought, well, I've failed my orals again, so I'm home free. I don't have to worry about this. And about that time, Secretary Weinberger and Judge Clark, the then National Security Advisor, came back in the office, and the President said, I was just getting ready to ask General Vessey to be the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And I went on to explain what I had explained to the Secretary, that my retirement papers had been approved and that my wife expected me to retire, and that we had a considerable financial investment in building a new house in Minnesota, and interest rates on my construction loan were around 20%, and I was becoming very poor very quickly. President Reagan said that he understood that he and Nancy had a house in California that they were concerned with getting rid of, and I thought, well, it's probably a little different. But anyway, he said, you go talk to your wife, and then he stuck his finger in my chest and said, I really want you to take this job. He said, I've looked at the others that have been nominated, and I want you to take this job. So come back and tell me tomorrow what you've decided.
Sir, do you think he was thinking about the fact that you started off as a private, now you were a 4-star general, and that you were one of the last generals from the World War II era?
I didn't question what the president was thinking about, and he didn't volunteer the information, so I really don't know. I don't know to this day why I was picked in over people who were certainly as capable as I was to take the job, but
And apparently you didn't talk him out of it because you took the job.
no, you know if you're serving in the uniform of the Armed Forces of the United States, and the President of the United States asks you to do something, you salute and do it.
General, I want to read a quote from your confirmation hearings before the Senate Armed Services Committee. You mentioned that you have risen to a rank that is far higher than any I ever expected or hoped to achieve. I realize that the promotions I've had are due to the fact that I've had some of the best people in the world working for me, and due to the fact that I have had the honor to work with and for some of the finest military officers in the world. Were there a number of officers that were your mentors that helped you reach that stage?
Yes. I was fortunate enough to spend a career working for people who were absolutely top-notch officers, whether it was our battery commander in World War II, a guardsman who was a top-notch officer, all the way up through every rank that I held. I think I was fortunate enough to work with 4 people that I admired greatly and who were mentors and helpers to me. And some of those, General Creighton Abrams, for example, who was the second commander of the forces in Vietnam and later Chief of Staff of the Army, was a model. My World War II commander, the second commander that the 34th Division that the Red Bulls had in combat, was additionally a superb model. General Charlie Bolte, who was later Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, a job that I later held, was superb combat commander, man of great character and integrity, a man who understood the American soldier and the importance of proper training and proper equipment and keeping the American soldier alive to do the job that he had to do. So, as I say, I was indeed fortunate to serve under some wonderful commanders.
Sir, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, you set the aura, the stage for the leadership. And I'm reading again from a speech you gave at the Naval Training Center in Great Lakes, Illinois in 1983. And you said, there are no unimportant jobs in the Navy or the Army or the Air Force or the Marines. It makes no difference what the color of a man's skin is who fights next to you, what state he came from, what religion he is, what ethnic background he is, whether he was rich or poor. What counts is what's in his head, what's in his heart, and what he can do with his hands to help the team get its job done. Your buddies depend on you. You depend on them. Learn to get along with them. Learn to make a team work. There really are no unimportant jobs in the military, are there?
No, that's certainly true. I've often used the example of the soldier or airman or marine or sailor driving the fuel truck that fuels aircraft. Sometimes we who were fortunate enough to be aviators get to fly above the dirty part of the battle, and we feel a little superior because we're above it. But in fact, if that soldier, sailor, or airman or marine didn't change the fuel filter on that fuel truck, and you wind up with dirty fuel in your airplane and your engine stops in the middle of wherever you are, it's a very bad day for you. And you realize that he or she is just as important and probably more important than you are at that particular moment. So there are no unimportant jobs in the armed forces.
Sir, I would guess a lot of those lessons you learned the hard way in with your combat experience in World War II and Vietnam.
That's true. That's true.
Saw it firsthand. Sir, your career began as an enlisted National Guard soldier, and you made it all the way up to chairman. What lessons did you take? Did your early lessons from the 34th Infantry Division help shape your career all along the way?
It surely did. General Abrams used to say the higher up the flagpole you shinny, the more of your backside shows, and don't forget it. Well, the other point that I would add to that is that the look from below is one that the people who look from above should never forget. What it looks like from looking at from the bottom rung on the ladder to the higher rungs on the ladder. And if you remember that experience and what it looks like from the bottom, you'll probably be a far better leader.
General, how important was it to get great support from your family during your career?
Well, absolutely. And that's something that the servicemen and women in every generation have learned, is that the families often have it tougher than the service person does. When you think of wives that are dealing with children in schools and difficult decisions to make about the future of the children. So the support of my family, wonderful wife and 3 great children who haven't stopped at jail and have continued to pay their taxes and go to church on Sunday, and so.
And here again, sir, the military's learned some lessons because they're providing a great deal more support for families today.
Minnesota does that job probably as well or better than any state in the Union. The work that the Minnesota National Guard has done with their Beyond the Yellow Ribbon program, both for deployed members and for returning members, it's a model for the rest of the nation.
General Burns put together a list of some speeches you made. That's where I found all of these quotes. But I noticed in there that you made quite a few speeches at prayer breakfasts while you were the chairman, and you spoke about your beliefs. During your career as a combat veteran, did you ever have any trouble reconciling your duty with your faith?
Well, I don't know that I had any trouble with it. There are decisions that one has to make that will certainly test your faith. I was blessed again by serving in outfits that had good chaplains, and that's been one of the wonderful things about the United States Army, is that we've had a chaplains corps that's been pretty doggone good, I would say. And we had a wonderful chaplain in our outfit during World War II. He was a giant of a man. He'd been a missionary in the Hudson Bay area before that time, and we called him Holy Joe Walker. Holy Joe was one of these guys that would come into the barracks on Sunday morning and announce that it was the Lord's Day to get out of bed and get to church. and I go through the long list of wonderful chaplains that have served with me. And Connie Walker was a great Army chaplain, airborne chaplain. He was the pulling guard that made Hugh McElhaney an All-American, and himself a Golden Gloves heavyweight champion, and was the sort of chaplain that knew that the chaplain's work is where the troops are. It's in the fight. Chaplain Walker was a Silver Star recipient for bravery in combat, and magnificent chaplain. General Nash, the Adjutant General of Minnesota, is a wonderful chaplain, and Chaplain John Morris, who's cut from the same bolt of cloth as those others. And I would just say that it's sort of like the story of Zacchaeus. I remember the Bible story of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. He was a short guy, like me, apparently, and he climbed this tree to see Jesus when Jesus was coming down the road, and then Jesus told him to come down from the tree, that he was coming to his house that day. And there's a non-biblical myth that's added to that story that says that for years after that, Zacchaeus could be seen going out regularly and watering that tree that he had climbed to see from which he had climbed to see the Lord, watering that tree and sort of patting the tree and taking good care of the tree. And his wife, so this non-biblical story goes, asked him why he did that. And he said it was because it was from that tree that he first saw the Lord. And I would say that the chaplain's corps is sort of like Zacchaeus' sycamore tree. It's the tree from which a number of soldiers maybe not necessarily didn't see the Lord for the first time, but were reminded that the Lord is there, whether they're in battle or in barracks or wherever it is, that the Lord is still there and still present in their lives.
And General, once again, I think the military has learned lots of lessons over the years, but when we talk about chaplains today, they not only minister to our troops who are deployed, but they minister to the families who are left back home.
Yes.
It's all very important, isn't it?
Indeed.
Sir, you've been very generous with your time. I wonder if you had the opportunity to talk to our young men and women today thinking about a career in the Minnesota National Guard or the military, what would you say to them?
Well, if you've got it in you, go for it. You know, today, the men and women in the armed forces today are much different than those of us who enlisted in the Depression days before World War II or during World War II even. They're bigger, they're stronger, they're better educated, probably smarter, but it's a tough racket. And if you're not tough, I'm sure the Minnesota National Guard and the 34th Division doesn't want you. But if you are, both mentally, physically, and morally, straight and tough, there's a place for you and an opportunity to serve the nation and learn something that you wouldn't otherwise learn, not only about the mechanical and technological things that the armed forces do, but learn about yourself and about the other Americans that you're going to live with for the rest of your life.
General, do you suppose that some of our 34th Infantry Division soldiers that are out there drilling this weekend, you suppose there's a future chairman in there?
Why not?
General, once again, thank you for your time. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with the Minnesota National Guard or our listening audience?
Well, to the members of the Guard that happen to be listening, I'd say thanks for your service. Continue to do well. The country's counting on you. And to you, Tom, I'd say thanks for what you do with this program. It's important to the state, not only to the people who serve, but also to the other people who listen to help understand the people who do serve.
Thank you, sir. It's been my pleasure to do this, and just a delight to meet you and have a chance to talk to you today.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, sir.